Absolutely, the stuff needs to be done, the budgets need to be managed, the performance indicators need to be done. Yeah, absolutely, that's important. They're competent managers as well. But what this is saying is that isn't enough. To kick off, I'm going to talk a bit about compassionate leadership. My interest really got sparked around working with very busy, very stressed out social work teams. This gives a perspective around some of the differences, and we'll explore it a bit more. But the idea of pity, I feel sorry for you; sympathy, I feel for you; empathy, I feel with you; and compassion, I am here to help. And then we have an increasing scale of understanding the other's experience and willingness to act to support. Compassion is, I feel you're suffering to such a high degree that I'm compelled to act. I'm compelled to take thoughtful, meaningful and intentional action to alleviate, prevent or mitigate that suffering. And the reason I think that's so important in leadership is because I think there is a great deal of suffering in the workplace. And sometimes the workplace can be the cause of it. Sometimes it can be the place where people bring it to. But either way, organisations and its leadership have a duty and obligation to respond compassionately. And there's also the notion of fierce compassion. And I think the area that I'm in is often working with organisations to try and move this idea of, well, isn't that all about the soft and fluffy stuff, Steve? You know, if we weren't so busy doing the business, we'd be able to do this kind of stuff with our people. But you just don't understand how busy we are. Like, I get how busy you are. But my feeling is, if you're an organisation that requires people to deliver its outputs, deliver its objectives, then relationships are really important. And my own feeling is that compassionate leadership is very much rooted in relationships. It's a relational approach to management, relational approach to leadership. Compassion fuels competitive advantage. You know, it's not soft and fluffy in that respect. You know, this is hard line, bottom line impact that a more compassionate relational approach can have within teams and organizations. It's really important around inclusion, because those leaders that really care and are intentional about showing care are much more inclined to want to include, to want to have a more participative environment, to be less inclined to command and control, and more inclined to empower and enable, and to give away control and to promote autonomy. And really importantly, compassion drives compassion. It is absolutely infectious. We know that when people experience it, they are far more likely to demonstrate it to others. The compassionate workplace is made up of lots of different factors. Of course, one of those is compassionate leadership, and that's hugely important. But it's also about how that ripples, the ripple effect around how compassionate the team operates. You know, the culture which the leaders and teams operate within. You know, are there reinforcing factors around compassion? Is that role modelled through the board or the trustees?
When we say compassion, we always think it's more human connection. But you have put systems and policy and procedures. This is very new for me. So I'm really curious to know how does that resonate?
Where managers and leaders have to enact an organizational policy, if that policy is overly rigid and doesn't enable them to respond to individual circumstances, then the very real experience of employees can be, hey, there's all this good stuff, and I'm seeing all this stuff on the internet about compassion and all the rest of it. But actually, I had a particular situation that I needed to take some leave, or I needed to take maternity leave. My experience of that policy was a nightmare. No one saw me as an individual in there. So I think the point is, we have to look at how the system works, how policies and procedures are going to reinforce and support managers and leaders to lead in a more compassionate way. We have what I've called the 360 degrees of compassion. The center of compassionate leadership is absolutely self-compassion. I work with a lot of serving leaders orientated by service, whose experience is that they're so purpose-driven, they're so values-driven, they're so service-driven, but they can't understand why they're burning out. And they get in this cycle of burn bright, burn quickly, burn out. And the idea of in their words, putting myself first is just, well, I couldn't possibly do that. Whereas the reality is self-compassion's core. If we're going to work with a high degree of regard for other people, we absolutely need to show ourselves the same level of high regard, because we really risk, compassion fatigue and that the real impact that can have on our physical and mental state if we're not careful. The workplace is changing. It's been changing for some time. So we're trying to position something around leaders also need to work massively on the relationships, that connectivity to their team, the relationships, and be more focused on relationships than they are on performance. And I know that sounds countercultural and can be a bit crazy. This isn't saying don't be focused on performance, but if your leadership role is purely on that, without the relationships and connectivity, I'm going to really challenge you as to whether in the long term that's going to have sustainable results for you.